The United States will not default on its $38 trillion national debt. It will not restructure it. It will not negotiate it down in some grand political bargain. Instead, it will do something far more elegant and far more dangerous. It will erase the debt quietly, gradually, and almost invisibly, using a method that has already been deployed, is currently operational, and requires no congressional vote, no public announcement, and no single moment of crisis that would alert the average citizen to what is happening. The mechanism has a clinical name in economics. It is called financial repression. And if you hold savings in dollars, in a bank account, in a pension fund, in government bonds, in any instrument denominated in the currency of the United States, this mechanism is currently reducing the real value of your wealth every single day. Not through taxation, not through fees, through the systematic, policy-driven erosion of what your money can actually buy. By the time this process reaches its logical conclusion, the government's debt burden will have been cut in half in real terms. The other half, the half that disappears, will come directly from you. This is not a theoretical projection. This is a strategy with a documented operational history. It has been executed before, successfully, by the same government, using the same institutional architecture, over the same type of debt accumulated under similar circumstances. The precedent is the period following the Second World War. In 1946, United States federal debt stood at approximately 119% of gross domestic product, a ratio remarkably close to today's level, which exceeds 120%. The debt was not repaid through austerity. It was not inflated away through hyperinflation. It was eroded through a carefully managed combination of two conditions maintained simultaneously over roughly 3 decades, from 1945 to approximately 1975. The first condition was moderate inflation, ranging between 2 and 6% annually during most of that period. The second condition was interest rate suppression, keeping the yields on government bonds below the prevailing rate of inflation. This gap between what savers earned and what inflation took from them is the core mechanism of financial repression. It functions as a hidden tax. No legislation required. The economic historian Carmen Reinhart, together with Maria Belén Sabrancia, published a landmark study through the National Bureau of Economic Research in 2011 that quantified this transfer. Their findings were precise. Between 1945 and 1980, financial repression liquidated debt equivalent to approximately 2 to 4% of gross domestic product per year. Over 3 decades, this reduced the real debt burden by roughly 40 to 50%. The money did not vanish from the economy. It was transferred from savers, individuals holding bonds, bank deposits, and fixed income instruments, to the government, which repaid its obligations in dollars that purchased progressively less. The savers received their principal back. They received their interest payments. Every contractual obligation was honored. But the purchasing power embedded in those payments had been quietly gutted. A dollar invested in a 10-year Treasury bond in 1945 could buy substantially less when it was returned in 1955 than when it was lent. The bondholder was repaid in full, nominally. In real terms, they were robbed. To understand why this mechanism works so effectively, consider what a government bond actually represents. When you purchase a Treasury bond, you are lending money to the United States government. The government promises to return your principal after a fixed period, say 10 years, and to pay you interest at a fixed rate during that period. If you buy a 10-year bond yielding 3% and inflation runs at 2%, your real return is 1%. You are slightly ahead. The bond has functioned as a store of value with a modest real gain. Now consider the same bond in a financial repression environment. You buy a 10-year bond yielding 3%, but inflation runs at 5%. Your nominal return is 3%. Your real return is negative 2%. Each year, the purchasing power of both your interest payments and your principal declines. After 10 years, you receive every dollar you were promised. But those dollars buy roughly 80% of what they bought when you lent them. The government has effectively written off 20% of its obligation to you, not through default, not through renegotiation, but through the silent mechanism of inflation outpacing your yield. This is how sovereign debt is truly managed, not through repayment, through depreciation of the currency in which the debt is denominated. And this is the mechanism now being activated at scale. The first observable anomaly is the Federal Reserve's behavior during and after the inflationary surge of 2021 through 2023. The Consumer Price Index peaked at a year-over-year rate of 9.1% in June of 2022. The Federal Reserve began raising interest rates in March of that year, but did so at a pace that kept the federal funds rate well below the inflation rate for over 12 months. During this period, the real federal funds rate was deeply negative, in some months negative by 6 or 7 percentage points. This meant that borrowers, including the federal government, were effectively paying negative real interest on their obligations. Savers holding cash and short-term instruments were losing purchasing power at the fastest rate in 4 decades. The Federal Reserve characterized its response as aggressive. The math tells a different story. Every month that rates remained below inflation, the real value of the national debt declined. A 12-month period of 5% negative real rates on $38 trillion of debt represents a real wealth transfer of approximately $1.9 trillion. That transfer went in one direction, from holders of dollar-denominated assets to the issuer of that debt. The second anomaly is the maturity structure of the federal debt. The Treasury Department has increasingly relied on shorter-term instruments, bills and notes maturing in 1 to 5 years, rather than longer-term bonds. As of mid-2024, approximately 1/3 of all marketable Treasury debt matures within 12 months. This concentration at the short end creates refinancing risk, but also maximizes flexibility. In a financial repression framework, short maturities are advantageous for the borrower. Each time a bond matures and is refinanced, the government has the opportunity to roll the debt into new instruments at whatever rate the current policy environment allows. If the Federal Reserve is suppressing long-term yields through its balance sheet operations or forward guidance, each refinancing cycle locks in below-inflation borrowing costs for another period. The saver is perpetually trapped. Their maturing bonds return depreciated dollars. The only reinvestment options available also offer below-inflation yields. The exit is closed. The third anomaly is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and its interaction with the Treasury market. Between 2020 and 2022, the Federal Reserve purchased approximately $5 trillion in Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities through quantitative easing. At peak, The Federal Reserve held over $8 trillion in assets, roughly one-third of the entire Treasury bond market. This purchasing activity directly suppressed bond yields by creating artificial demand. When the largest buyer in any market is a money-printing institution with no profit motive and unlimited capacity, prices rise and yields fall below where a free market would set them. The technical term is yield curve manipulation. The practical effect is that every bondholder, every pension fund, every insurance company, and every foreign central bank holding treasuries earned less than they would have in a market free of central bank intervention. The Federal Reserve began reducing its balance sheet through quantitative tightening in mid-2022. But the pace of reduction, approximately $60 billion per month initially, later slowing, means the balance sheet will remain far above pre-pandemic levels for years. The suppressive effect on yields persists, and with it, the financial repression mechanism continues to operate. The fourth anomaly involves the Consumer Price Index methodology and its role in masking the true rate of purchasing power loss. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has modified the calculation of the Consumer Price Index multiple times since the Boskin Commission recommendations of 1996. These modifications, including hedonic quality adjustments, substitution weighting, and changes to the housing component using owner's equivalent rent, have consistently produced lower inflation readings than the methodology used in the 1970s and 80s. Economist John Williams, through his Shadow Government Statistics Service, calculates inflation using pre-1980 methodology and consistently finds rates 3 to 5 percentage points higher than official figures. If the actual rate of purchasing power erosion is 5 to 8%, while official inflation reports 2 to 4%, the gap between what savers think they are losing and what they are actually losing is catastrophic over time. This discrepancy is not incidental. A lower reported inflation rate reduces government expenditures on inflation-indexed programs like Social Security. It keeps public expectations anchored, preventing the wage price spirals that would force the Federal Reserve to raise rates to levels that would make the national debt genuinely unserviceable. The measurement itself has become part of the repression architecture. The fifth anomaly is the behavior of the Treasury Department in managing debt issuance during the current high-rate environment. Beginning in late 2023, the Treasury shifted an unusual proportion of new borrowing toward short-term Treasury bills rather than longer-duration bonds. This decision, made under Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, attracted criticism from financial analysts who noted that it effectively front-loaded the government's exposure to refinancing risk while minimizing the current interest expense. In a normal debt management strategy, a borrower facing rising rates would extend duration, locking in current rates for as long as possible. The Treasury did the opposite. The implication is that the Treasury expects rates to decline substantially in the near future. This expectation only makes sense in a scenario where the Federal Reserve will lower rates aggressively, potentially back to levels that again fall below inflation. If this occurs, the Treasury will refinance its short-term obligations at suppressed rates, and the financial repression cycle will accelerate. The sixth anomaly is the accelerating de-dollarization by major foreign holders of Treasury debt. China has reduced its Treasury holdings from a peak of approximately $1.3 trillion to below $800 billion over the past decade. Japan, while still the largest foreign holder, has reduced its pace of accumulation and occasionally sold into the market to defend its own currency. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting non-dollar currencies for oil transactions. Central banks globally increased gold purchases to a record exceeding 1,100 metric tons in 2022, with similarly elevated levels in 2023. These are not panic moves. They are strategic repositioning by institutions that have calculated the trajectory of the dollar's purchasing power and concluded that holding Treasury bonds at current yields is a losing proposition. They are exiting the very instruments through which financial repression operates. The domestic holders, American pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and individual savers are being left to absorb the bonds that foreign institutions are quietly selling. These domestic holders are, in effect, being positioned as the primary targets of the debt liquidation strategy. Two frameworks explain these converging signals. The first framework is benign. Pandemic-era fiscal expansion required extraordinary measures. Inflation was transitory, driven by supply chain disruptions, and the Federal Reserve's response, while imperfect in timing, ultimately succeeded in bringing price increases closer to target. The Treasury's debt management decisions reflect standard institutional practice. Foreign diversification out of Treasuries is a natural evolution of a multipolar global economy. Consumer price index methodology changes reflect genuine improvements in measurement accuracy. Under this interpretation, there is no strategy. There is only the inevitable complexity of managing the largest economy in human history through an unprecedented global disruption. The second framework follows the accounting. Every policy action taken since 2020 has widened the gap between what savers earn and what inflation takes. Every methodological adjustment to inflation measurement has lowered the reported rate. Every structural decision by the Treasury has shortened duration and maximized sensitivity to future rate cuts. Every central bank action has suppressed yields below market clearing levels. Every one of these actions, independently, has an institutional justification. Collectively, they constitute a wealth transfer mechanism that is liquidating the real value of the national debt at the expense of anyone holding dollar-denominated savings. The evidence distinguishing these frameworks lies in specific, traceable data. Federal Reserve meeting transcripts, released with a 5-year delay, contain discussions of distributional effects of monetary policy. Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee minutes reveal the reasoning behind issuance decisions. The financial accounts of the United States, published quarterly by the Federal Reserve, show exactly who holds Treasury debt by sector and how that composition is shifting from foreign official to domestic private. International Monetary Fund working papers on financial repression, published by researchers including Carmen Reinhart, explicitly model the scenarios now unfolding and calculate the expected transfer from creditors to sovereign debtors. The global response to this dynamic follows a pattern of informed silence. The European Central Bank faces its own version of the same arithmetic. Eurozone sovereign debt exceeds 90% of combined gross domestic product. The Bank of Japan has been operating the most aggressive financial repression regime in the developed world for over 2 decades, holding bond yields near zero, while inflation has finally begun to rise. The People's Bank of China manages a currency that is strategically undervalued to maintain export competitiveness, a policy that requires continued accumulation of foreign reserves, though increasingly in gold rather than dollars. The International Monetary Fund publishes annual Article 4 consultation reports on the United States that note fiscal sustainability concerns in carefully hedged language, but stop short of identifying the specific mechanism by which those concerns will be resolved. The Bank for International Settlements, the institution that coordinates central bank policy globally, has published research explicitly modeling financial repression as a debt reduction strategy, including estimates of its magnitude and duration. These are not secret documents. They are publicly available. They are simply written in a technical register that ensures they will never trend on social media or lead a news broadcast. The architecture is in place. The historical precedent is documented. The policy tools are deployed. The target, $38 trillion in nominal debt, reduced over 15 to 25 years through persistent negative real interest rates, is achievable without a single default, without a constitutional crisis, without any event that would register as an emergency in the public consciousness. The cost will manifest not as a crisis, but as a chronic condition. Your savings account will grow. The number will get larger each year, but the food, housing, healthcare, and education that number can purchase will shrink at a rate that slightly exceeds your interest earnings. The gap will be small enough in any given year to attribute to bad luck, to market conditions, to the wrong sector. Over a decade, the cumulative effect will be unmistakable. Over 2 decades, it will be transformative. The government's debt will have been substantially reduced in real terms. Your wealth will have been substantially reduced in real terms. And no one will have signed a document, held a press conference, or cast a vote that you could point to as the moment it happened. That is the elegance of financial repression. It requires no conspiracy, only patience, institutional continuity, and a public that measures its wealth in nominal terms while the real value quietly disappears beneath the surface, like water draining from a bathtub so slowly that you only notice when you try to stand up and realize how shallow it has become. The question that remains is not whether this is happening. The arithmetic is settled. The question is, who among the institutions responsible for protecting the value of your currency will be the first to acknowledge publicly what their own research papers have been describing privately for over a decade, and what it means that not one of them has?